Thanks for having me. And thank you all for coming tonight. So many people, like almost all seats are taken. Tonight, as Ursula mentioned, I would like to talk about GitHub Actions, what it is, what you can do with it, and basically how you can automate yourself away slowly. And the word of warning, before I start, I will throw a lot of new concepts at you today. The first test run of this talk took like 40 minutes. I hope it's not too long and not too boring, but I hope you learn something new here. I'm also a bit of a fast talker, as you hear here, but I try to keep it slow. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand and ask. And yeah, a couple of words about me. As Ursula mentioned, I'm Stefan Zweifel. I call myself a full-stack developer. I have been working with Laravel for the past 9 years and with GitHub Actions since its inception in 2019. But on to GitHub Actions. What is Actions? Actions is a so-called continuous integration and continuous delivery platform by Google, by GitHub. And it's built right into the web UI of GitHub. It's omnipresent. If you've worked with pull requests before, they show up at the bottom of a pull request. But what is continuous integration? That's a description I found made by Red Hat. Continuous integration and continuous delivery, often abbreviated by CI/CD, is a system or method to deliver apps to customers frequently by using automation. Such a long word. In simple terms, it basically means you always test your code or your software in a fresh environment. Basically, if your changes do not break the app, you could basically deploy it to your users or your customers. And the most common part of CI/CD is running your tests, unit and integration tests of your app, and on each commit you basically make, or on each push you make to GitHub. And as I mentioned, if a change breaks something, you might not be able to deploy something or merge a pull request. GitHub Actions can do that, but so do other CI and CD products like Circle CI, GitLab, or Jenkins, which are a bit older. But GitHub Actions is capable of much more than just running your test suite. You can listen to any event happening within the GitHub platform, not just a git commit push, so much more, but more on that later. And before I show you some real-world examples, first a quick intro how to write such GitHub Actions workflows. They're all written in YAML. And these YAML workflows are stored in the .github/workflows folder. That's very important. They can only live there. And you also have some issues sometime if you edit them on the GitHub web UI. GitHub will ask for permission and pipapo. It's not so nice. Maybe just edit them on your local machine and push them on. And here's a very simple example of a workflow. I hope everyone can see it. It checks out your app, sets up PHP, installs Composer dependencies, and runs our test suite, in this example with pest. And new configuration files always look intimidating at first, but I promise you it's really quite simple to understand. At the top, there is a name key. It should be short and expressive. It will be shown in a couple of places in the GitHub web UI and the GitHub desktop app. I've used a slug here, but you can also write a name with spaces in it. Next is the on key. That's the trigger word or the trigger key. In this case, we use a value of push, indicating this workflow should run each time a commit is pushed to the repository. And next is the core part of a workflow, the jobs definition. And the workflow can have multiple jobs. In this case, we just have one with a key of test and the name of PHP 8.2. And we tell Actions to run it on the latest version of Ubuntu. It could also use or run on Windows or macOS. macOS is a bit more expensive, though. I think Windows too. Ubuntu is the cheapest one. And next, we define the steps each job should execute. First, we check out our repository, the code. Then we use an action called setup.php and tell it to configure or install PHP 8.2. And next, as you might have guessed it installs Composer install, this Composer install action. And finally, we just run a shell command, in this case, vendor bin.pest. This could also be a PHP unit or PHP spec if you use that thing. Yeah, and you might have noticed I've emphasized some words here. Workflows, jobs, steps, actions. These are all important concepts in GitHub Actions. A repository can have many workflows, A workflow can have many jobs, a job has many steps, and a step can be either a shell command or use an action. And before we switch to the available events, more complex examples, a quick word on those actions. We used checkout, setup.php, and Composer install. Just like Composer and npm packages, actions are bundles of code, usually made by others, and abstract away some complexity. For example, the setup.php action by Shivam installs a given PHP version and all its required extensions or the extensions you want. If you have zero knowledge about server management or how to install PHP on a Linux server like I do, this action takes away a lot of work. Or the Composer install action by Ben Ramsey, it doesn't just run Composer install for you, it also caches the dependencies in each workflow run. So if you push to GitHub multiple times per day or hour, each workflow run runs a bit faster and thus improves the feedback loop you're looking for. You could write all this caching logic on your own. You could just run Composer install on your own with a shell command. And you can cache this on your own too, but I think just adding a single line of code to your workflow is so much easier, such a better developer experience than writing this code all on your own. And like Composer packages, everyone can write GitHub actions. They can be written in many different languages, Bash, TypeScript, Rust, Python, what you want. A simple Bash script that just runs a CLI like, I don't know, say or whatever, is already a valid action. GitHub itself provides an SDK written in TypeScript that can help you write actions that are more integrated with GitHub. For example, you could create a comment on a pull request, close a pull request, close an issue, add a label, or whatever else you can do with the GitHub API. But you can write actions in PHP too. That's what I do, and it works quite well in the past. There are also a couple of ways where you can store your own actions. You can either add the source code directly to your project, so you don't have to make this all public if it's something confidential to your company. You can also add it to a separate repository that's private, I think, that works, or public, and use that in your workflows. Or if you want to share it with the community, there is a GitHub marketplace where you can submit your action and others could use it. For example, this stale issue here, for example, is made by GitHub itself and closes issues after 90 days, for example, and annoys many, many users. So if that's a thing you would like to do, if you would like to start working with actions or are looking for actions, the marketplace is a good place to start. Okay, that's the very basics. A quick recap. That's a good word. You've learned GitHub Actions is a continuous integration platform made by GitHub, not Google. You can write your own workflows in any of your public or private repositories. And actions are basically code made by others that abstract away complexity. Okay, let's talk about events. Workflows, as I mentioned, are triggered by listening to an event that happened within GitHub or can even be outside of GitHub. In the previous example, we used push. That's probably the most common event there is. It's emitted when you push a commit or a git tag to your repository, be it on your default branch or on your pull request. Currently, there are 36 available events to which you can subscribe your workflows to, and probably the most common ones are these ones. There is push, as I mentioned, pull request when something on a pull request happens, release when you release a new release, repository dispatch to trigger a workflow through the GitHub API, workflow dispatch to trigger a workflow through the GitHub UI on the web or the CLI, and schedule to schedule a workflow in the future. I will go into detail to some of the events in a second, but before I start, I also want to mention that you can subscribe to different activity types and branch patterns. For example, you can write a workflow that only listens to commit pushes that happen to the main branch or to branches that start with releases. For that, we just added a branches key to the push event and defined our pattern there. And for activity types, let's look at pull requests. The pull request event, as I mentioned, happens when something on a pull request happens. It's first opened, it's closed, a new commit is pushed, or a label is added or removed. And to run a workflow when a pull request is first opened, you could subscribe to the opened activity type like this. You add a types key there, and the type of opened, there is also closed, and something third I forgot to write down here. And I couldn't really come up with a good example how you would even do this. So here are some other examples you might use in a pull request. For example, you could use PHP CS Fixer or Laravel Pint to automatically fix all the style issues you have in your project, or refactor your app with a PHP tool called Rector, or run static analysis with Selm or PHP Stan. Okay, on to more events that can trigger a workflow. The release event. It's probably more interesting to you if you write open source packages like maybe Sandro does, or create a new release in your projects itself often. It's triggered when you publish a new release on GitHub, and a release is not the same as a Git tag. Just to keep this in mind. For example, you could write a workflow that sends a Slack message or a tweet to your team or followers and tell them, hey, new release has been published. And I've created a workflow that listens to this event in basically all my private and work-related projects for two reasons. The first one is we use private composer packages. At work, we currently have just one private composer package, and we couldn't use the private packages service on packages.com. So we used a self-hosted Satis composer registry. And Satis is a tool also made, I think, by the guys that made Packagist that you can self-host, and it's also a composer registry. And basically, whenever a new release is tagged in our private GitHub package, we run this workflow that just makes a curl command. Very simple, but this curl command in turn triggers a repository dispatch event, which I will explain later, that just triggers a refresh of this registry. So when a new release is created, in a couple of seconds, the package can be downloaded in your project. And the other reason I love this release event is changelogs. I really love changelogs. I love them so much. I've written 3 blog posts about them and created a CLI that keeps them up to date. And in all my app and package repositories at work and in personal projects, I've added a workflow that listens to the release event that automatically keeps the changelog up to date. So I basically add the changelog to the release body, and this workflow in this step here takes that out and puts that in the changelog and commits the file back to GitHub, and everything is automated, so I don't have to think about anything. I just add, a new release. Here are the changes. Let's do it. And I can even show you a live demo here. If GitHub is working, it works. Okay. I created a new package in the last few months, which I will explain a bit later. It's called Laravel Backup Restore, and it's basically ready for prime time. So I've prepared a release here. Let's release it here. Create a new release. Wait a few seconds. And in the Actions tab here is an update changelog run that hopefully starts today.
It's starting. Is generally changelogs based on differences in code, or does it use commit messages?
It just uses the input you provide in the release. But that's very simple, basically. I just put a simple thing in there. But I use another action called release drafter that automatically creates the changelog for you with added, changed, removed, and deprecated headings, and does this all for you. So here it is. And in the code, there is a new commit with this thing. Awesome. Okay. There are many more. Okay, package is released. Okay, the next event is the repository dispatch I mentioned before. It can be used to trigger a workflow from outside the repository or even outside of GitHub. for example, with this curl command I used earlier. And I used this in the past, as I mentioned, to trigger a new status composer registry build, but I also used this for another maybe weird use case. I use Sentry, error monitoring platform, and they also have something called deployment tracking. And basically, for those who don't know Sentry, it's basically the same as Flare by the Spatie guys. It keeps track of all your errors and exceptions. It stores them and associates them with the user. So if a user breaks your app, you immediately know, oh, Ruslan clicked a button or uploaded the wrong PDF. Yeah, you can hunt him down. It also supports tracking releases. That's how this looks like for one of my side projects. And basically, if you release a new version of your app and an error happens, Sentry can associate the error to the release. Basically, there are no issues here, but I think it would be useful if I know this. While writing the talk, I thought maybe I should just cut this. I don't really know if it's worth it, but it's a good example here. And I've added a step in my deployment process to send a request to the GitHub API again. It's basically, again, a curl command that happens in my deployment script that triggers this workflow. And we're using here an action made by Sentry itself that runs the code. But why not just call the Sentry API directly in the deployment script? Why make it such a hassle? That's basically because Actions has a great secrets management built in. You can add your API keys, your tokens to the repository or your entire organization, and they can't be read anymore basically just by the GitHub Actions code itself. They are never shown in the log files. So it's pretty secure thing, and I think it's a bit safer than just to send Ruslan his key and everyone his key, and everyone has to look, oh, how do I implement this safely and add it in the right steps. Yeah, that's basically it. And yeah. The workflow dispatch event is the next one. It can be used to trigger workflows manually from the GitHub Web UI or the CLI. I basically add this to all my workflows as I don't want to make a meaningless commit sometimes. I just want to say, okay, run this. And I'm tying everything together. I use this all the time to deploy my apps. And here's a quick video how this looks like. Basically, there is a run workflow button that appears with a popover that appears, and I can select the branch that should be used in the workflow. And as this is a deployment, I can also say which environment I want to deploy. Staging, production, and after a few seconds, the workflow appears.
That's so cool.
And again, I have a live demo here. Let's deploy a new version of my side project. As you can see, there are a couple of deployments in the past here. So here's this button. I've updated the workflow. Now we can even add select buttons here. So let's deploy to production and hope everything works. But I don't think we wait for this because it takes 2 minutes. Ah, yeah, that's what I wanted to show. You can also add environments. GitHub knows this system of environments. And if you add this, you even get this nice little progress bar that shows, oh, we are in the third part of the deployment. And if you go into details here, yeah, it's basically just a nice way to visualize, oh, how far is the deployment.
Mm-hmm. And so you run inside now the deploy script?
Yeah.
Composer install and stuff like that?
Yeah, now it's deploying. I run a tool called deployer, which is also written in PHP. It's a bit like Capistrano in Ruby, and that does all the stuff here.
So you just call deployer? It's not like deploy script is inside this?
No,
okay.
It's just a shortcut, basically.
Nice.
It's basically pretty nice if you're on the run or need to deploy something or just need to reload the server sometimes.
Yeah.
That could work.
Cool.
Yeah. The next one is workflow run. Sounds very similar to workflow, what was it? Dispatch. And this can be used to chain workflows together. So you have maybe a deploy workflow and another workflow that should depend on each other. And it basically gets always triggered when a workflow starts or finishes. But for what could I use this event? I use GitHub's Dependabot in all of my projects. It keeps all my JavaScript and PHP dependencies up to date. Basically, when Laravel releases a new version on Tuesdays, I could get a real-time update pull request for that update and could merge it to my project to be super, super on the edge, basically. However, I don't want to manually review all these pull requests. I'm only interested in the pull requests that fail my test suite or are major versions, because probably there are some breaking changes and I need to make adjustments to my code. And I use GitHub Actions for this too. I've created an auto-merge workflow that's just this, and it's triggered when my test workflow finishes. And completed, as I mentioned before, doesn't necessarily mean that the tests have passed. It just means, okay, the tests workflow has run, but it could also have been failed. And to prevent merging the pull request, we do this if clause here, where we get the conclusion of a workflow run. And if that's successful, it usually means the tests have passed. And then we basically just add a personal access token here, or pass a personal access token, and tell this action, which another guy made, I don't know how it works, and we just say minor, merge all minor and patch versions, if everything is okay. So yeah, whenever a new dependabot pull request is sent to my repository and the workflow is triggered and the changes didn't cause an error, the pull request is automatically merged. We also use this setup at work, and we run Dependabot on the first day of each month, and we get like 150 pull requests each first day of the month, and 120 to 130 pull requests are automatically merged. We don't have to do anything. And at 20 or 30 pull requests, I guess, we have to manually review them, but most of the time it's just an issue of GitHub itself. They run into, what have I noted here? Internal errors, rate limits of its internal system. By the end, we just have like 3 to 4 hours each month we have to spend, and all projects of us are up to date. That's pretty neat.
So cool.
Let's watch Bender. Okay, the last event of today, schedule. As you might have guessed it allows you to schedule workflows in the future, just like you can use the scheduler in your Laravel app. This is great if you want to run your test suite every night, for example, or make a nightly release of your software. Or you might also use this to generate a new version of your statically generated website, for example. That's also what I've done in the past. Many years ago, I had a problem. I wanted to figure out how many times a major Laravel version was downloaded each month. I was debating with myself if I should still support version 5 dot something, so we're at 11 now, 10? So long time ago. And the packages page back then didn't have such a nice download statistics as it has today for the major versions, so I just built my own. I created a new Laravel app, created an SQLite database, an artisan command, a job that calls the packages API, and stored everything in this SQLite database, then added some blade views, a controller that generated these ugly charts, and, and created a static HTML website of this thing, and that's basically it. I then added a scheduled GitHub Actions workflow that clones the repo, updates the download statistics in this step here, and builds a new version of the site and commits everything back to GitHub. And GitHub then hosts the page with GitHub Pages, I think. And this runs now every month for the past, I don't know, 5 years or so. I don't have to touch it. You can even see it's PHP 7.4. So yeah, I never touched this.
It's working.
It works. Just works. Yeah.
So cool.
Okay, another great use case that's relatively new for me is backup integrity, which is tied again to the backup package from before. I use Bati's Laravel backup package in basically all my apps to create daily or weekly backups. And at work a long time ago, I also wrote an artisan command that imports the backup again. We basically just use this to, sometimes we have an issue and need to validate with the real database. And I basically just thought I want this in all my apps. And in March, I started working on this package here, or that we released earlier. And as I mentioned, it does exactly what you expect. It downloads the backup, decompresses it, and imports the database dump in MySQL, Postgres, SQL, and SQLite, I think, yeah. And the cool thing is, it also runs on GitHub Actions. And in combination with the schedule event, you can basically build your automated backup integrity checker. And here's how I've done this in my project. It's a bit small. So let's switch to a better view. So at the top, there is a workflow dispatch event again, so I can manually trigger it, not just on a schedule. In this case, it's scheduled to run on the first day of each month on 2 p.m. And yeah, the rest is basically pretty straightforward. We start a MySQL instance. That's also a cool feature of GitHub Actions. You can add predefined services. For example, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Redis, and a bunch of others, I don't know. And you can also bring your own Docker images, I think, here. So MySQL just runs here, then we check out the repo, set up PHP again, Composer install, blah, 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 blah. And then here at the bottom, we run backup restore, tell it to use the latest backup, and tell it to don't ask us any questions, just run. And I just gave it the database password and access to my AWS backup bucket. And that's basically it. Oh, and then in the end, I wiped the MySQL database again. I probably am sure that GitHub clears the database before it destroys the whole infrastructure again, but I'm a bit paranoid here. So how do I get back here?
Better safe than sorry.
Exactly. So let's run this again. Oh wow, now it's fast.
So it's pulling the Docker image first.
Yeah, exactly. It also basically pulls the Linux image from Docker. Basically everything here is Docker. So if you know Docker, this is your thing here. So I don't know Docker. I cry my eyes out here sometimes.
I can feel you.
Yeah, it takes forever. Let's let it run here. So yeah, you haven't seen it, but I think it's pretty cool. Not only do I now have automated backups of everything, I also have automated health checks of my backup. I always get notified if something breaks or it doesn't restore properly again. Because remember, backups are only worth something if you regularly test if they actually work. There is nothing more frustrating than needing a backup in an emergency situation only to realize that the backup doesn't work. That's what I had last December, and that's why I actually wrote all of this. Okay, so let's talk about some other cool features. We are through all these events. There are many more, as I mentioned, all documented in the documentation. The next one is Matrix, and it's not a movie featuring Neo and Morpheus. It's our Matrix strategies in action. With Matrix strategies, you can create many variations of a job without duplicating your workflow code. This is really handy if you want to test your software on multiple operating systems, PHP or Node versions, for example. This is an example from earlier. We added a strategy key with Matrix, OS, and PHP here to tell actions to run it on PHP 8.0, 8.1, and Windows 2. And yeah, GitHub Actions makes a matrix out of this, and in the end, and we updated this here and over there, and in the end, it just runs it 6 times in this little format here. This is 8 times, it's a different project. Yeah. This is often used, probably most often used in open source projects. Laravel, I think, probably tests all the different PHP versions at once. But you can also use this in private projects. That's what I do with my team at work. We use this to update our app to new major Laravel versions. Basically, we do this every spring, I think, so February, March. We just add a new PHP version to the matrix, let it run, see if it works, and if it's green, we basically merge it and deploy it to production. So you don't have to, okay, it's not a very good example, I know this. Let's go to the next topic. Another cool feature I would like to mention is that you can make jobs in a single workflow depend on each other and wait for each other. And the keyword here is needs. Like the strategy keyword, we just add a needs key to our job definition to tell actions that this job should start only running once all the other given jobs have completed successfully. And in this example, we have 3 jobs, build, test, and deploy. And build doesn't have a dependency. It should start first. And then comes test. Test needs build to run first, so it waits. And deploy needs build test to run successfully, and only then it starts. If we don't have this, it would run all 3 jobs simultaneously and run in parallel, and would deploy something without testing and building it. I also use this technique for my blog. My blog is a very over-engineered Laravel app. I have a job that checks my content for too many bad words or too many typos. Then it generates a static HTML bundle with a package. And in the end, it deploys it to Vercel. And GitHub visualizes these steps and job dependency pretty nicely with these graphs. So as you can see,
Laravel app is deployed to Vercel.
Yes, but it's HTML's website. It's not a Laravel app, so.
Oh, okay.
I think you can deploy Laravel to Vercel. That works.
Okay.
I've also done this in the past. So yeah, as you can see, it starts with content checker, runs for 45 seconds, then builds it, then deploys it, and it could also deploy a preview to a Vercel preview domain or URL, or how this is named. And I've also had a step validate RSS feed, but I've disabled that. And again, a little live preview demo. We now have created a new, or I tagged a new version of this package, and I've prepared a blog post. And as you can see, there are these jobs that run, or these workflows that run, and just squash and merge and hope it deploys correctly. But this takes quite a lot of time. I think it takes 5 minutes or so. So we let it run, maybe come back to it later. Okay, now I've talked like, 30 minutes about GitHub Actions and how cool and useful it is. And you're now maybe eager to introduce it to your team or organization. But you are fearful to have to maintain so many YAML files. And fear not, the last cool feature I would like to show you, but you can't see, is reusable workflows. As the name suggests, you can reuse workflows with, basically it's a first party or first class feature made by GitHub. And to start using reusable workflows, you should probably create a new repository, name it reusable workflows, for example, and just copy all your workflows you want to make available in there. And the only thing you have to change is the event that triggers the workflow. So no push, no schedule, there is only workflow call. And this is the example from earlier with the merge me action, where we just added a secret, merge me GitHub token, and use this below in the jobs definition. And that's basically it. In our project, we can then replace the whole body of jobs and steps and everything and just point it to our organization, repo, and the path to the workflow file. And that's basically it. It now takes the code from your central workflow repository and uses it, and it just works. Awesome. The most important thing here is you have to make the central repository public. You can't make it private. I think only the highest tier enterprise customers can use private repositories here, but I'm not 100% sure. You can even version your workflows. That's not just here in the reusable workflows possible. Here we just use @main to use the default branch and just use the latest commit, but you can also introduce major versions or minor versions and write them down here and just use that specific version, or even the specific SHA is also something you could use. That's probably the right approach if you're in a bigger team or bigger organization where a lot of people are dependable on your workflows. My team and I use reusable workflows too. We made them public. Well, they are public, and they are available at 2media/reusable workflows. I will share this all later on. They're obviously very specific to our work, but as you can see, we also have this auto-merge dependable pull request workflow, so maybe you can just copy it or even use it directly, but on your own risk. The Laravel organization use them too. They have a .github repository with a workflow folder in it. As you can see, there is a config standards, coding standards workflow that runs Laravel Pint, I think, and some other things like compile assets, update changelog is also there. And yeah,
Are they using your workflow?
Yes, they are. Dries is coming at me from time to time with questions and improvements. So.
Cool.
So to recap, before I end my talk, there are workflows that are triggered through events. We looked at matrices, at dependencies between jobs, reusable workflows, parallel and serial execution. I think I skipped that part, but that's basically with the jobs and needs definition from earlier. If you don't tell that the job is dependable on each other, it runs all in parallel and runs pretty fast. But if you make them dependable and wait, it takes longer and costs more money. Yeah. Okay, hammer everything. Okay, I could go on and on and on and on and on and talk more about how one could create your own GitHub Actions with a tool like Laravel 0. That's, for example, what I used with this changelog updater action. That's just a PHP CLI, which in its core is a Laravel app that takes some strings or markdown string and transforms it. So that's maybe for another time. As you probably noticed, I really like GitHub Actions. I hope I could transfer some of that enthusiasm to you. You try it out in your next project or use it in your organization soon. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out now, after the talk, or social media or email. And that's basically it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome.